Hey guys, EIGA here. In today's video, we're going to take a look at undervolting the 5090 ASTRAL. Earlier this year, I did a similar video with the 5090 Founders Edition and results were great, near stock performance with a massive reduction in power draw. But I want to take it a step further today and answer a question I've had on my mind for a while. Can we actually beat stock performance with an undervolt? Stick around and let's find out. The test system I used is the same one seen in my XiKii FF07 build video. Inside, we've got the 9800X3D CPU, slotted in the ASUS B650 EI motherboard and cooled by the IS67XT from ID Cooling. On the software side, I've got both ASUS GPU Tweak 3 installed, as well as my tool of choice, MSI Afterburner. While both of these can be used for undervolting, I have a strong preference for Afterburner. It has a cleaner UI, especially with skins, a really great developer, and it just works better. In fact, I was able to get better undervolting results than with GPU Tweak, but more on this a bit later on in the video. There is, however, a good reason to keep GPU Tweak installed if you own an ASTRAL. And that's because it's the only card on the market that can actually monitor each of the 6 current carrying pins on the 12-volt high power connector. Given the problematic history of this connector, this is a great feature to have, and GPU Tweak will alert you should it detect an issue. To make use of this feature, I also made this ASTRAL-only version for my RTSS overlay, which shows per pin amperage in real time. It pulls the sensor data from hardware info instead of GPU Tweak, but I still recommend running GPU Tweak in the background in order to take advantage of that alert feature. If you like the overlay, it is available on my Patreon alongside regular versions, and your support there is genuinely appreciated. Anyway, let's go over the actual undervolting method. In terms of settings inside MSI Afterburner, I have voltage control and monitoring enabled, but that's it, you don't really need to touch anything else here. To get started, we first open the curve editor. Here we have target frequencies on the vertical axis and corresponding voltage points on the horizontal axis. It essentially describes the card's boosting behavior from idle to full load under ideal conditions. What we want to do here is cap the maximum allowed voltage and then offset the target frequency as high as we can get it before we run into instability. In other words, we're overclocking at a lower maximum voltage. I settled on the 890 mV point for today's testing as I find it to be the sweet spot on 5090s. I like to do the offset and flatten method, which in my experience gets the best results. The first step is to hold Shift and drag to create a selection over all the points to the right of our target voltage point. Once that's done, with our desired voltage point selected, we go to the main Afterburner window and add a GPU clock offset of 1000 MHz. Before hitting apply, we go back to the curve editor where we can click on any of the points inside the selection we made earlier to drag all of them down. You don't need to be very precise here, just make sure that the highest voltage point is now sitting below our offset voltage point. Finally, we hit apply in the main Afterburner window. If your 5090 voltage frequency curve is similar, you'll notice that the point will drop down slightly. In my case, it drops down to 2827 MHz, which seems to generally be the limit for 5090s at this voltage point. Chances are, most 5090s will be stable at this frequency and voltage. If you go for a higher voltage, you will need to experiment with reducing the offset, as an offset of 1000 will start putting you at unstable frequencies. For instance, my 935 mV profile can only handle an offset of 520 before it becomes unstable. Lastly, you'll also want to add a 3000 MHz offset to the memory clock. This too is the maximum allowed overclock here, and the memory chips on these cards can generally handle it with no issue. The best way to ensure that the memory overclock is stable is to test performance, as error correction will kick in before getting artifacts or crashing. On both the ASTRAL and my 5090 Founders Edition, performance increased all the way to the maximum of 3000, and this memory overclock is an almost free performance boost. And that's it, you've got yourself an undervolted 5090. The last step is to save the undervolt settings into a profile, and you can also set the profile to be loaded at system startup, but only do so after you're certain that the undervolt is stable. I guess now's a good time for the disclaimer. An undervolt is only really stable under the conditions in which you test it. Drivers, VBIOS updates, or even games using new technologies may turn a once rock-solid undervolt into an unstable one. The unusual 5090 voltage frequency curve makes it so that you can probably copy the same settings, but there's no guarantee that it will work. Always test for stability, as each card is different. Personally, I test using a variety of titles, in particular ones I know to be especially sensitive, like Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition or Portal with RTX. To keep things simple, I tested the games which showed the biggest performance delta between stock and undervolt in my previous video with the 5090 Founders Edition. This way I could have a clear target to beat. The first test is God of War Ragnarok, running my custom automated benchmark run with the result averaged across 3 runs to eliminate variance as much as possible. At stock we get an average of 309 FPS and a power draw of 414 watts. With the undervolt applied but no memory overclock, we get a performance drop of 2.6%, with power draw dropping by a nice 20%. With the memory overclock applied, we recover almost all the lost performance while still getting an 18% decrease in power draw. Lastly, with the better than stock profile, we're now beating stock performance by a tiny bit, while still enjoying a reduction in power draw by almost 50 watts or 11.6%. As mentioned earlier in the video, I also tested the same undervolt settings through GPU tweak instead of MSI Afterburner, and the results I got are quite a bit worse, a near 8% performance loss. Maybe I'm doing something wrong and the voltage frequency editor in GPU tweak should be used differently, so let me know down in the comments if that's the case. Let's see how things look in Portal with RTX, running at 4K with DLSS quality and frame generation. At stock, we're nearly maxing out power draw with an average of 565 watts, netting us 127 frames per second on average. With the plain undervolt, we again get a 20% reduction in power draw with a 1.6% drop in performance. Bringing back the memory overclock, the memory bandwidth increase sees us beating stock performance by 2.4%. The better than stock profile gets us almost a 4% performance increase with a reduction in average power draw by 11.4%. Personally, I'd still pick the more efficient undervolt profile, but big number is indeed better. Lastly, for good measure, I also did a synthetic test with 3D Mark Steel Nomad benchmark. At stock settings, we're nearly at the thermal limit of 600 watts, but we failed to get a score higher than 15,000. With the plain undervolt applied, we are trading 100 points for 100 fewer watts. It's not a bad trade, but we can do better. The higher memory bandwidth sees us back on top while still enjoying a near 16% drop in power draw. Lastly, the better than stock profile gets us an above average score here with a 7.4 reduction in power draw. We should really stop using the term undervolting. It's really a tune that we're doing here, and by leaving things at stock on a 5090, you leave performance and efficiency on the table. You can even go higher on the voltage axis and use the same method for traditional overclocking. In fact, that's exactly what I did to get personal high scores in 3D Mark with both the ASTRAL and my own 5090 Founders Edition. Another characteristic of the 50 series cards when undervolting is that if you watch the core frequency in games, you will notice that it's much lower than the target frequency and lower than the one you'd get at stock. I have no idea why this happens, but it is something to be aware of. This is why I focus on performance and efficiency testing, as that's what ultimately matters here. And while I showed average frame rates in the slides earlier, I also checked 1% lows and frame times, and the results are consistent. And I almost forgot about the biggest advantage of an undervolt: temperatures. Here's a 20-minute soak test in Star Wars Outlaws, running with all bells and whistles on, with fixed fan speeds for consistency. Looking at the log, we see a massive drop in temperatures with the 890 mV profile, 13 degrees on the GPU core and 12 degrees on the memory, and that's despite the VRAM chips running at higher speeds thanks to that 3000 MHz overclock. So let's sum it up. With undervolting, you can have a cake and eat it too. Lower temperatures, fewer watts, and the same or even better performance compared to running the card stock, provided you put in the time, of course. Lastly, one other thing I'd like to cover quickly are idle temperatures. When you add an offset to the frequency voltage curve, it lifts the entire curve up, including the idle voltage points, meaning your idle frequency will be higher as a result. However, I haven't noticed any difference in power consumption at idle. The effective clock at true idle will run at something like 35 MHz at stock, versus 150 MHz with the undervolt applied. It's a non-issue as far as I'm concerned, so I would just leave the voltage frequency curve as is. That's it for this video. I hope you guys found it interesting, because I really love doing this kind of testing and content. I've got some really interesting small form factor videos planned out for the remainder of the year, and I'm really excited to get to them, so stay tuned for that. Bye for now.